Thank you very much, Joanne. Yeah, the Midwest is, unknown to all of you. I know it's just a wilderness of Boy Scouts and racism and bigotry and homophobia. And I was a Boy Scout. I'm embarrassed to say it's an upstanding fascist organization that I'm disassociated with now. But I do hope maybe with a few words about the subject, I could maybe change your view about Boy Scouts and felons in the same evening. I hope so. Well, I have been working opposing nuclear weapons for probably 30 years, but 19 years as a member of the staff of Nukewatch, which is a nonprofit nuclear watchdog organization in Wisconsin. It started in Madison, and then we moved out to the country. There's an office we built in an intentional Catholic worker community called Anathoth Community Farm, which is now expanded to embrace lots more than the Catholic worker itself. But it started out as one of the agronomic university that you've all studied, thanks to Peter Moore and others. We still grow lots of vegetables that we help share with the sister community in Duluth, Minnesota, the Loaves and Fishes community. And the Nukewatch office moved out of the big city and to this farm in 1996. So I worked for 15 years in the same office with the great Bonnie Urfer, whose name might be familiar to you. There's a photograph of her in our most recent newsletter. I brought a stack of the newsletters tonight. Please take one, and please subscribe if you're interested in nuclear power, nuclear weapons, radioactive waste, and nonviolent resistance to all of it. That's what we report on 4 times a year there. Bonnie's picture is there because she's currently incarcerated, leaving all of her work to me in the office while she's in Ocilla, Georgia, a private, for-profit contract jail that's run by some money grubbers who get a contract from the feds to keep Halliburton and others, hundreds of female prisoners in the southeastern Georgia jail where the food is so inadequate that her body's been reacting terribly. She's been retaining water. These stories are common to everybody in this room, all of us having known imprisonment at some time or another. So send your thoughts to Bonnie that her health issues might be resolved while she's there. She has till January. The judge could have let her out in September at sentencing after she'd done 4 months, but he added another 4 months. So she's there till January, along with 4 other of the 12 who were arrested 4th of July weekend, declaring independence from the bomb at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, one of the principal nuclear weapons facilities in the country. They make the uranium blanket, so-called, that is used to surround the plutonium and hydrogen bombs. They've been making it there for 50 years. We celebrated Nukewatch's 30th anniversary there with a big gathering and lots of civil resistance at the site. And so several people are paying the price for that civil resistance by doing some time. Well, in the course of these many years working to inform myself about nuclear power and weapons, I took a lesson from our founder and mastermind, Sam Day. Some of you may have known the great Sam Day, who insisted that we need to inform ourselves about the dangers of nuclear power at the same time that we condemn nuclear weapons, because they're all the same companies, the same pollution, the same consequences for reproduction and health consequences. Now, tonight I've got some pictures. I'm not a professional when it comes to these slideshows, but I tried to arrange a few photographs and pictures to illustrate the presentation, which I'm calling Dangerous Plumes of Disinformation, because I'm sure anybody here who's been following the story of the radiation disaster that began March 11th at Fukushima Daiichi, it's known as in Japan, know that the information has been outrageously poor and deliberately misinforming millions of people around the world. I'd like to start with this from this week's New Yorker magazine. Yukio Edano was the Prime Minister Kan's chief spokesperson and probably the principal misinformer in the Japanese government, who made statements like this and continues to do so for months and months. This is one of the first statements out of his mouth. This 3-reactor catastrophe was a result, as you know, of the largest earthquake ever to shake Japan, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake, a country that knows earthquakes every day. I mean, it's such a regular occurrence that shaking and rattling like in California, people pay no attention. But this earthquake was flabbergasting. We know that about 26,000 people were killed or are still missing. Widespread contamination by long-lasting isotopes, including cesium, strontium, and even plutonium, has resulted. An early estimate of about $250 billion in damages. That's a lot. That's about €4. Just kidding. Euros. That's a joke I stole from Stephen Colbert. Well, you may have heard early on, this is the plume that resulted after the third of 3 major explosions there. I shrunk this picture a little bit, so it's hard to decipher. There's a yellow line, a green line, and a red line. The interior red line is the more severe of the shaking that went on March 11th. This is the New York Times photograph of one of the tsunamis. There were several waves that raced into the northeast coast of Japan. This is a photo of one of them. You can see cars tossed around like toothpicks. And the press at the time of this disaster, when it first started, compared it to the bitter end of World War II in Japan, saying this catastrophe is comparable to that. This is a photo of Nagasaki. Hiroshima, where 140,000 people died. Another photograph of Hiroshima. Over and over again, this disaster was compared to that. This is a photograph inside the exclusion zone now, a 20-kilometer, 12-mile radius around the 6-reactor complex known as Daiichi. Some of the victims, of course, were swept out to sea by the tsunami in its retreat and lost forever. And some of the bodies tossed around in contaminated water were themselves contaminated. You could say there is a radiation gusher that has been spewing from this particular site. It's poisoned soil, rainwater, tap water, seawater, groundwater. And in addition to all this incinerator ash, you see the rubble in this photograph. Much of this rubble has been taken to incinerators and burned to reduce the volume, but the ash then that accumulates and has to be disposed of from the incinerator has been found contaminated with cesium-137. It's a very long-lasting radioactive isotope. Other things contaminated, as you know, include vegetables, milk, mushrooms, beef, fish, tea, animal feed of all kinds, which results, of course, in the animals being contaminated, corpses, as I mentioned, and even airports. Some of the first travelers to flee from Tokyo and to land in Houston, Texas, set off radiation monitors in Houston and made headlines just a few days after the event. Somebody want to help me with the pronunciation of this beautiful, formerly beautiful town? It's a beautiful word, isn't it? But just shocking consequences. 10,000 people still missing. This is the same town. Maybe you saw some of photographs of the ships that were just tossed like corks onto bridges and other buildings. So the consequences of this disaster cubed, earthquakes, a tsunami, and large radiation releases can hardly be exaggerated. And within this blizzard of radiation that's been coming from these sites, which includes waste being dispersed from a waste fuel cooling pond that overheated, boiled off the cooling water, and then has partially burned. Within this blizzard of radiation, there is this plume of disinformation that we need to be alert to. And what I'm referring to specifically are these reassuring but false and insidious lullabies about safe, harmless, or not immediately dangerous radiation exposures. I think everyone in this room already knows there is no level of radiation exposure, no matter how small, especially internal exposure, that is harmless. Every federal agency that regulates radioactive pollution in this country agrees. Government and industry have conspired, as seen in newly disclosed internal email memos, to downplay the severity of this still ongoing disaster and to withhold crucial information. When these agencies or universities or spokespeople from the industries involved with this, with nuclear power, they often say, and when they do, the amount of radiation did not reach a dangerous level. The listener is led to believe in error that there's some level that's safe. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission in this country, for example, says otherwise. Any amount of radiation may pose some risk for causing cancer. Any increase in dose, no matter how small, results in an incremental increase in risk. Now, this is what the NRC says in its published website information. But when an NRC spokesman jumps in front of a microphone at CNN or NBC, they do a completely different story. And this happened over and over again since March. Same with the Japanese government officials who know otherwise. Dr. Chris Busby, a watchdog, founder of the low-level radiation campaign in the UK, founder of the European Committee on Radiation Risk, and its chief scientist, has warned that reassurances about radiation exposures issued by the Japanese government cannot be believed. Those assurances are based on an invalid risk model, which the ICRP, that's the International Commission on Radiological Protection, itself has admitted cannot be applied to accident situations. The ICRP sets radiation exposure standards for industry and medicine and science, but they aren't set up to deal with massive dispersal of radioisotopes as is going on from Japan right now. The minimizing of Fukushima's huge radiation releases began right away when the media, government, and company officials reported the venting of hydrogen gas. How many had heard references to these hydrogen gas explosions like this one here? Over and over again, you heard hydrogen cause these explosions. It sounds rather benign, doesn't it? Because along with this explanation of a hydrogen explosion, these officials almost always said there was no health threat from them. Even after the explosion destroyed parts of reactors 1, 2, and 3, and the extremely dangerous waste fuel pool of reactor number 4, the promise of the promise of safe levels of radiation release was repeated. It was just hydrogen, after all. On the contrary, as Barbara Rose Johnston has reported in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the hydrogen released is tritium water vapor. Tritium being the radioactive form of hydrogen. It's a low-level emitter of radiation that can be absorbed in a human body simply through breathing or by drinking contaminated water. Let's have some. Principal Japanese government spokesperson, who was mentioned earlier, Mr. Edano. He was chief cabinet secretary to the prime minister. As I said, was one of the worst propagandists. On March 21st, he asked the public not to overreact to reports of radioactively contaminated turnips, cauliflower, cabbage, and parsley in Japan. He said, even if you eat contaminated vegetables several times, it will not harm your health at all. Then he hustled back to his office. Spinach was at the time found contaminated with radioactive iodine-131 at 27 times the government's established limit. And this particular sample was found 50 miles away from the facility, far beyond the exclusion zone, the evacuation area, which was only 12 miles in radius. Of course, some people in Japan and the world weren't buying these lullabies, these false assurances. And some people high up in Japan's government also began protesting. After breast milk in 4 Japanese women was found April 21st to contain radioactive iodine-131 again, the chief nuclear advisor to the prime minister, his name is Toshizo Kosako, resigned in protest. And he made a spectacular speech to the Japanese parliament April 30th. And he blasted his own government's decision to permit children living near the wrecked reactors to be exposed to doses of radiation equal to the international standard, the ICRP standard I mentioned earlier, for adult reactor workers. As we know now, after 50 years of studying in the nuclear age, children, pregnant women, fetuses, infants are far more susceptible to a given dose of radiation than an adult male. And adult white Caucasian European ancestral men are the standard that the ICRP is set up to judge radiation risk against. It's referred to in the literature as reference man. The women in the audience ought to appreciate that. It's archaic, it's unscientific, it's completely outdated scientifically because of what we know about the effects, especially on fetuses and pregnant women, and breast tissue itself being far more susceptible to radiation doses. There is an international campaign being led by scientists in Tacoma Park, Maryland, that you might be interested in helping to support. It's called Healthy from the Start, and the group is called Institute for Environmental and Energy Research, IEER.org. I have their website at the end of the slideshow here. And their campaign is to beef up the standards, get rid of reference man as a standard of risk assessment, and protect women and children first. As they raise the standards so that the most vulnerable are protected. Well, as I said, after breast milk was found contaminated April 21st, the highest level scientist in Japan resigned in protest. This picture is here somewhere. Saying that he wouldn't allow his children to be exposed to what the government was proposing be allowed, and that he couldn't allow it as a scholar, and went back to teaching. He had confirmed it and did confirm in this speech to Parliament what critics had been complaining of since March 11th, that the government was withholding information about radiation levels in and around the exclusion zone, and that it had set overly high limits on radiation exposures for workers who are still doing short shifts as they try to bring the reactors and the leaking waste fuel pools under control. You know, the doses are accumulated so fast that they can only spend short amounts of time in these hot zones. A lengthy and damning investigative New York Times report of August 9th, maybe you saw this, full-page report on the anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki, said that Japanese officials admitted to the Times that government authorities engaged in a pattern of withholding damaging information and denying facts about the nuclear disaster in order to limit the size of costly and disruptive evacuations. And this is outrageous, and it's tragic because the consequences are going to be suffered by the people who aren't being evacuated, who don't feel compelled to leave and aren't being warned about the contamination that they're being exposed to. And just as an example of what they are being exposed to, we do have to compare what's happened in Japan to Chernobyl. This is a before aerial photograph of the 4 reactors. There are 2 others not pictured here to the right, but these 4 3 of them were operating at the time the tsunami hit. Japan is well versed in building nuclear reactors. They have 54 of them. Every one of them is built on an earthquake fault because Japan is crisscrossed with earthquake faults. You can't build anywhere in Japan without building on an earthquake fault, and they know that well. So these reactors are built much better than those in the United States to withstand earthquakes. But they were built to withstand a 7.0 earthquake. So the one that struck was 2 orders of magnitude more severe. They were also prepared for a 30-foot tsunami. Unfortunately, that 30-foot seawall was inundated 20 feet because the wave that hit this reactor complex was 49 feet high, almost 50 feet high. And the tritium gas or hydrogen explosions, you can see, destroyed 3 of 4 reactor containment buildings. And this doesn't show earthquake damage, of course, which rattled these machines severely before the tsunami and the explosions ever occurred. This is just an example of the minimization of what we know to be true. 3 of these reactors have suffered core meltdowns where the fuel, the uranium fuel inside, loses all of its coolant, overheats uncontrollably, and then melts to the bottom of the pressure vessel, so-called, and it is so hot, thermally as well as radioactively, that it burns through the bottom of this container and can then burn through a concrete pad under that and threaten the groundwater. And if it comes into contact with this groundwater, then creating another steam explosion there. But you can see that Bloomberg Business Week turned 3 full-blown meltdowns into a single partial meltdown just a couple days ago. So the accident is getting less and less severe every day. As you can see, in April, these machines were still venting huge quantities of radioactive steam, severely damaged containment buildings. I have to say, these are photographs taken by unmanned drones, maybe the only useful purpose to which they're put, is really good photographs. Unfortunately, it's of a disaster that we aren't going to see the end of for many decades. This is the headline that ran about the deliberate withholding of information about the plume of radioactivity that first left these sites and traveled inland, and the fact that the government refused to tell the people to evacuate this area. And comparing it again to Chernobyl, 350,000 people were evacuated from an 18-mile zone around Chernobyl. In 1986, after a single reactor there exploded and burned uncontrollably for 40 days. 1986, April. Japan is limiting its evacuation to about 160,000 people from, as I said, a 12-mile radius, in spite of the fact that cesium-137 was found in a village 25 miles from Fukushima in amounts that were over twice the evacuation standard used at Chernobyl. And what we have in Japan is a far more densely populated territory than we know of, than we had in Ukraine, the site of the Chernobyl reactor. Densely populated and heavily populated with women and children, of course. Now that, of course, explains why an evacuation would be so costly. But yet all the more reason to make sure it's done. Surveyors in Japan found up to 3.7 million becquerels per square meter. Becquerel is one of these obscure references to radioactive decay. It's 1 radioactive decay per second. So it's not a lot, but 37 million in a square meter is a sizable amount. To compare, a becquerel, 1 radioactive disintegration per second to a Curie, which is a huge amount of radiation. When you hear references to so many Curies, that's 37 billion radioactive disintegrations per second. So a Curie is a vast amount. A becquerel is not that big. But then you have to multiply it 3.7 million times in a square meter. Now this is what they found 25 miles from Fukushima. The abandonment and evacuation standard used in Chernobyl was 1.48 million becquerels. So what was found in Japan, over twice the contamination. So some of the people in Japan have taken it upon themselves to decontaminate their own towns by bulldozing away the top 6 or 10 inches of topsoil, which of course is a limited sort of stopgap measure, because you do have to containerize that material and bring it to someone else's landfill then. Yet to protect the children from walking and playing in this soil, that's what has to be done temporarily. On June 7th, this summer, Japan's Nuclear Regulatory Agency doubled its estimate of how much radioactivity had been dispersed, but they did so in a rather mysterious and confusing way that raised more questions than it actually answered. It said that in the first week of the crisis, from March 11 to March 18, 770,000 terabecquerels, they love to write this in the paper like we all know what the hell they're talking about, were spewed into the air in 1 week. Now a terabecquerel is 1 trillion of these 1 disintegrations per second. 770,000 trillion becquerels, which is a lot of radiation. But it compares strangely to the previous estimate that they made public on April 12th. They said 370,000 terabecquerels in the first month. So they're trying to confuse everyone by these announcements, partly because they themselves are confused. The tsunami itself, which smashed this reactor complex full force, head-on, knocked out all the gauges and monitors and equipment with which they might have measured radiation releases. There were 24 air monitors set up on posts around this facility at various distances. 23 of them were wrecked by the earthquake and the tsunami. So this is guesstimation, wild guesswork on the part of the company, Tokyo Electric Power Company, otherwise known as TEPCO. And that's what we're stuck with. Much like what happened at 3 Mile Island in this country, where the monitors, the air monitors that were measuring radioactive releases from the 3 Mile Island reactor all went off scale. There's so much radiation being spewed that after your gauges go off scale, you're making a guess and telling it to the governor, and the governor goes in front of the microphone and says, no danger to the public. That's usually the first thing out of the officials' mouths. The U.S. government has been just as reckless with its action and advice. According to Kevin Mayer, a U.S. government diplomat who was working in Tokyo, who has since resigned and written a book on this subject, the State Department there in Tokyo considered evacuating 90,000 U.S. citizens from Tokyo. They talked about it in the offices. They said, well, that would cause a panic and it would undermine severely the U.S.-Japan alliance. So we're not going to do that. They did say that the evacuation of people out to 50 miles should take place, something the Japanese government didn't agree with and hasn't adopted. And then about a month ago, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, our agency, shortened that or shrank that evacuation recommendation back down to 30 miles. So they're saying that the amount of contamination or radiation exposure in a given area is actually coming down over time. President Obama has, here's a photograph of the 2 disaster sites. Before I move on to President Obama, I would like to say one thing about the International Atomic Energy Agency's declaration about a month after this started that it wasn't a level 5 disaster, radiation disaster, but they increased it to the top level of severity, number 7. But that's 1 through 7 scale that the International Agency uses to let us know the severity of a radiation accident was established after Chernobyl. It was designed to describe Chernobyl, and that was then called the worst, number 7. But that involved a single reactor only. So you might call this a 21 if we're going to compare things oranges to oranges instead of apples to oranges. President Obama and other officials declared that the plume of radioactive gases and debris would not reach California. They said the only thing to do, the best thing to do, is to stay informed. I love that. The more informed you get, the more you find that Mr. Obama was lying too. They soon had to retreat. Hundreds of news accounts now from every state in the United States have reported on contamination of U.S. water, air, milk, and food.
John,
I've got more on that in a minute.
next to Unit 3 that's getting hosed down is Unit 4 that was supposedly in a state of shutdown.
Yes.
And yet the damage there looks as though it exploded just like Unit 3. Do you have a guess as to what happened at Unit 4?
I think that Unit 4 is where the waste fuel pool was that was shaken so badly that it lost, it was cracked, and the coolant either leaked out or because of the loss of backup circulation, generation of power to circulate the cooling water boiled off. So part of the damage to number 4 was this problem with the waste fuel pool building, and the fact that a fire started around that building, and the U.S. chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission said that the pool had been drained of coolant at one point. He later backed off of that claim, but the first thing he said was that that pool's melting and burning because the coolant is all gone. I believe that was in that building.
Four was one of the shut down reactors, right?
Yes, it was shut down at the time of the earthquake and the tsunami. It was shut down for refueling, which is part of the natural working progress of a reactor. You have to turn them off to replace used fuel with fresh fuel every couple of years. And it's this hot, fresh waste that comes out of those things, which is so dangerously radioactive and thermally hot as well as radioactively hot. It goes into these cooling pools that I had a photograph of earlier, before and after. Here's what they look like when they're working properly. You can see the fuel is packed closely together, and this is under deep, deep water. This is a close-up of the pool. There's 14 feet of water on top of these rods, which are, again, 14 to 20 feet high themselves. This is what happened to that building and the pool itself. It looks like it's been completely broken apart. Well, the downplaying of the radioactivity that is spewing from this and spread around the hemisphere takes kind of strange forms. One way that we know of to downplay the severity of this accident is to stop measuring for contamination. And on May 16th, it was barely a couple months after it began, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission announced that it would halt its 24-hour-a-day operations center, which was monitoring, using these airborne monitors all over the country to check for this plume. And it would then go back to its ordinary routine of monitoring, which is that every 3 months the government will look at the milk supply, and once a month it'll look at rainwater. As Kevin Camps has reported, he works for Beyond Nuclear in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and he's an expert on this subject. He said the government doesn't want to know what's in the air and the water and the food, and it doesn't want us to know either. So again, in Japan, the people who are most concerned about this have taken on monitoring themselves. The CNIC, Citizens Nuclear Information Center in Tokyo, is one such group of scientists in Tokyo, and they and others are taking on monitoring on their own. Greenpeace has been really good on this, demanding the right to test water off of the Fukushima site where seawater has been severely contaminated. And they're also monitoring air and soil outside the exclusion zone. They were monitoring, Greenpeace activists were monitoring inside the exclusion zone until the government announced that reporters and monitors would no longer be allowed for their own safety into the exclusion zone under threat of arrest. To my mind, that's just more simply information control by the government. Well, there's so many examples of the disinformation that I'm referring to repeatedly. I don't know how much to repeat myself, but a couple of examples were pretty striking. Eric Talmadge of the Associated Press, who knows better, just regurgitates what unnamed, anonymously speaking government officials say over and over. He said, after radiation levels were reportedly 300 times normal just south of Fukushima, he quoted a government official who said it would take 3 years of constant exposure to these higher levels to raise a person's risk of cancer. This is outright lying by the government official, but then the reporter himself just shows appalling laziness in not doing just a minor short look at the websites for the EPA, the NRC, the Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services. All these government agencies admit on their websites that there's no safe exposure to radiation. The Los Angeles Times was just as bad. They finally admitted, after saying it wouldn't, that the radiation was reaching California in the plume that was being blown across the Pacific. But they said, experts say the amount will be well within safe limits. Now, this is a little bit of a confusing statement. They meant to say within allowable limits, not safe ones. Because we know there's no safe exposure, but there are allowable limits because the government sets them. They can, as an industry, contaminate the water, the air, and the soil with certain amounts of radioactive effluent, partly because reactors can't operate without spewing some into the air and to the water. They have to do that to regulate pressure and heat and vibrations inside these giant reactors. So they're allowed some contamination of the water. The limits aren't safe, but they're permitted. The Los Angeles Times on March 17th, not just early on, announced that it did not expect dangerous levels of radioactivity to hit California. Well, there's no safe level, so what are they talking about? Chernobyl caused extensive fallout of cesium, which persists in the environment for 300 years. It's got a 30-year half-life. Half of it decays away in 30 years. You still have half. So you normally have to take what's known as the scientific half-life, multiply it by 10. And that's how long a given isotope will persist in the environment. So for cesium and strontium, about 300 years. The New York Times did say that cesium persists for centuries. That was close. They could have said 3 centuries, but at least it's better than calling it safe. On the other hand, the New York Times said March 26th about the cesium contamination that happened in Chernobyl. They said that kind of fallout has not occurred in Japan. So disinforming about that. October 2nd, the London Financial Times said that even plutonium itself had been found 40 kilometers away. Contaminated hay for animal feed was found 85 miles away from Fukushima, and beef cattle 20 miles from the site was contaminated with cesium. Well, another minister involved with radiation safety in Japan, his name was Goshi Hosono, said about eating contaminated food, even if you eat it every day, it might be a problem, but if you eat just a little, there'd be no effect on your health. As I said, cesium contaminates the environment for decades. It cycles through the ecosystem and concentrates in muscle. So in the case of Japan, we know that they eat a lot of fish in Japan. It's a very popular part of the diet, and the company's been allowed to pour thousands of tons, tens of thousands of tons of contaminated water into the sea outside these reactors. And the fishing people have protested this, but they're incapable of preventing the government from contaminating the sea. Right away, a small popular fish called the sand lance was banned, the use of it in Japan, putting thousands of fisher people out of work. And the sea currents in that part of the ocean move directly to the Alaska fishery in our country, so we can expect the same sort of contamination of salmon and large fish there too. Well, to say that this kind of contamination didn't happen in Japan, that cesium didn't happen in Japan, is rather surprising, since there are so many reports of cesium contamination all over Japan. You don't have to look very hard to find that. So it's a little mysterious why some of these papers report so inaccurately what's going on there.
Are you talking about Japanese reports or American reports?
Both, actually both, yeah. There is some good reporting being done by Japanese dailies, much more so nowadays than other papers around the world who have given up on this story in large part. But the Japan Times and another paper called Asahi Shimbun is very good, and you can read these papers online, English translations, if you're interested. Forbes said April 11th that cesium had been found in milk in Vermont. And this is, one other phenomenon that is on the front headlines, and people get alarmed by it, and it's gone then the next day. But iodine 131 above the EPA's recommended maximum level was found in drinking water in dozens of U.S. cities in April. It found the EPA cesium and tellurium in cities in Idaho, Nevada, Hawaii, Florida, Utah, and it found iodine 131 in Washington, California, Arizona, Idaho, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Tennessee, Montana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Colorado, Michigan, New Jersey, and Alaska. And yet Forbes went on to grossly misstate the EPA's position on this very radiation. They said that the contamination found in the Phoenix, Arizona sample contained 3.2 picocuries per liter of iodine 131. That's another obscure measure of contamination. The Forbes report said the EPA's maximum contaminant level was 3.0. So, quote, the EPA does not consider these levels to pose a health risk, end quote. In fact, the EPA officially says, quote, there is no level below which we can say an exposure poses no risk. So as I mentioned earlier, in their published reports, they know and tell us there's no safe dose, but when you get them in front of a reporter, they dissemble. It's amazing. The governments allow this permissible or legal contamination, as I said, to permit the industry to continue operating these dirty reactors. We have 23 in this country that are exactly the same design as these Fukushima General Electric Mark I reactors. They have the same faulty cooling pool problems of being susceptible to a breakdown of backup generated electricity. In case the electricity goes out, you have to keep that water circulating. And in this country, the cooling pools full of these terribly dangerous waste reactor fuel rods are not required to have backup generators. Not a one of them out of 23 in this country. So Kevin Camps, who I mentioned earlier, and Beyond Nuclear, and about 700 nuclear watchdog groups in the country, we got to deal with this, have called for improving the operation of these cooling ponds by having these companies install backup generators. Industry is fighting this tooth and nail because it's expensive. Well, sadly, some of the decontamination that's going on in Japan is simply to hose down these buildings and move the water into the street, into the sewer system, and then into the lakes, rivers, and the ocean. This is called decontamination, but it's just moving contamination around. This person's decontaminating in elementary school, but the Washington Post had the honesty to report that cesium could also be washing away and spreading to other areas, contaminating rivers, low-lying land, and the ocean. This is called decontamination, though. I mentioned earlier that internal contamination is more dangerous than external, and yet there's very little internal monitoring that's going on in Japan. There's a lot of this kind of monitoring of external contamination. It's much more expensive to do blood and urine analysis than to run a wand over your neighborhood kids. This is the scientists that resigned in protest. Well, Fukushima is still releasing large amounts of radiation, but we're not exactly sure of the status of the reactors right now because the information is all being controlled by TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, which is being allowed basically free rein to deal with this disaster response. After cesium is in the milk in Vermont, it's interesting to go back and read these assurances that this material wouldn't even reach the United States. California is too far away. Mm-hmm. These are some of the places where contaminated food and water, milk was found in this country. This is the great Greenpeacers out trying to do their independent analysis. Quite a long time ago, this Nuclear Regulatory Commission member, James Astelstein, warned about the eventuality of these sorts of disasters. He said this after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. And my friend Alfred Meyer, who's here tonight and worked with Physicians for Social Responsibility and other groups, nuclear watchdog organizations have said ever since 3 Mile Island that these accidents are inevitable. And for that reason, these reactors shouldn't be allowed to operate at all anymore. We can do without the power that's produced, the electricity that comes from them, by replacing the power used with efficiency and conservation measures. We all know this. And with renewable forms of energy production that are so much safer and produce so many more jobs, and they're cheaper also. One piece of really great news on this level is that the wind power installation in this country in 2009 just ballooned. 9,900 megawatts of electric production from wind was installed in 1 year, in 2009, in this country. And that's the equivalent of 4 large nuclear reactors. And any one of these reactors takes 10 years between the time you start proposing it and get through all the red tape and licensing and operating licenses and get the thing constructed. So it's easy to see that wind power and conservation can replace this fake dependence we have in the myth of safety that was referred to by the former Japanese Prime Minister Kan. He's now resigned. Before he resigned, he said Japan would end all its consideration of new nuclear reactor construction, which is a good thing. And his replacement, the new Prime Minister, has repeated that promise and said that he too will work against any new construction of reactors. Whether or not they're going to shut down the operating ones, as Germany has promised to do, is yet to be seen. But there are serious and sober reasons to see the shutdown of these machines. On the anniversary this April, the 25th, of the Chernobyl catastrophe, the Guardian newspaper in London looked back and made an interesting analysis that applies now to Fukushima. They reported March 27th, scientists say that radiation will affect the Chernobyl area for 48,000 years, although it will be safe enough for humans to begin repopulating the area long before that, in about 600 years. That's what we are faced with too now in Japan. Long periods of permanent depopulation and decontamination. And we need to demand a little more in-depth decontamination than is being proposed now in support of our brothers and sisters in Japan and the young people here who now have even here consumed contamination through the milk and water supply. So thank you very much. We've got time for questions.